There's always madness. You can just step outside and close the door on all those dreadful things that happened. You can lock them away forever.
I was 16 years old when The Killing Joke came out, and it was shocking. You know, you're used to reading things where people was like, we're gonna take over the world. And then you read something like that where Gordon's watching these pictures of his daughter lying on the ground with a gunshot in her spine.
It's basically a horror story. It's very, very small scale. It's not a big epic battle. There's nothing mythological about it or larger than life. It's really kind of just ugly and down to earth.
There's no way to know up front what's going to be the enduring piece of art. You find out 30 years later, you just see that it's still working. It is a very simple Batman and the Joker story, but it tells you all the information you need. It gives you all the pieces. So if you've never read a Batman comic, you could read this and completely understand who everybody is and how they all fit together.
The backstory that Alan Moore tells about the Joker, it's straight out of Kafka's short story.
Even after how many years it's been out, people are still debating what each panel meant or how the ending was or what Joker did to Barbara. You know, there's a lot of things that are a little open-ended.
It all kind of started with The Killing Joke. It definitely influenced Tim Burton in the first Batman movie. Clearly it influenced Christopher Nolan when he was making The Dark Knight. For better or worse, that's kind of become the default setting for the Joker, is this guy who's not just kind of scary and kind of wacky, but he's absolutely terrifying.
Barbara! I wouldn't worry yet if I were you. It's just a psychological manifestation, common among librarians. She thinks she's a coffee table edition.
Joker, for the most part, was a well-liked character because of the flamboyance of the character. You know, he's still violent, he's still deadly, but it was more about the gags and the stunts than it was about the psychological terror he inflicted. This is psychological terror more so than, you know, worrying about a hand buzzer that might electrocute you.
Sometimes, you know, in the comics they'd played him as like this goofy guy who does clown-based crimes and stuff. And then there are other times they tried to make him more of a genuine threat to Batman and to others. But The Killing Joke was the first time that anybody really started taking him deadly serious.
It's kind of a persistent phenomenon that there can be villains who do terrible things and yet somehow keep a hold over the popular imagination. Well, what's the appeal? Why would anybody want to identify with, even for a moment, people who are capable of horrible acts? Even though the acts are horrible, they convey a sense of freedom or liberation that is appealing even underneath all of the blood and gore. People like the Joker operate outside of typical social norms and restrictions. And for the rest of us who are not serial killers, even though we can judge and find the acts appalling, there could still be something appealing about the life of an outlaw, literally outside the law, that keeps the rest of us more constrained. Batman says, I'm gonna take the scariest stuff, the night, the darkness, vampire capes, bats, and I'm gonna show you the justice that lies in the deepest part of the night. And the Joker does the opposite. I'm gonna take what's gleeful, what's whimsical, what's childlike and supposed to be innocent, and I will show you the horror in the middle of that.
It's tapping into a primal fear. People are afraid of clowns. They're laughing, but they're also hitting each other on the head, and they're falling and breaking their bodies, and they're a scary scenario for kids especially.
Well, I had some really interesting nightmares.
Barbara!
The Joker's white face is meant to elicit the feeling of a cadaver, of a dead body, which gives you that feeling of like something that's come back from the dead, something that's unnatural. He looks a little bit like a skeleton, you know, because his cheeks are so gaunt, his chin is so long, like someone who's had everything sort of like sucked out of him. When the Joker does his laughing gas ceremony, the smile is the death mask. So it's that intimation of death that he always brings.
All I can see is that I'll be making a killing.
Comic books in many ways are the modern version of fairy tales. All those fairy tales deal with the element of primordial evil. Usually it's, you know, embodied in the character of like a witch, or like it's in the woods, or it's a troll. They took the representation of the evil that we all feel among ourselves and they give it body, they make it corporeal. And the Joker is that. He's that sense of the evil that everybody's capable of, or the idea that lives inside of everybody, and let's give it physical form.
Yes!
I mean, the Joker is a horrifying maniac, but before he became the Joker, everything was going wrong for him. And he was clearly losing it to start with. And then when his wife dies in literally a freak accident, it makes it okay for him to just go crazy.
The comic falls into a vat of acid, gets washed out into the Gotham River, pulls off the hood. His face is now completely white. His hair is green, and he looks at himself and he starts doing this maniacal laughter.
If you don't laugh, you're gonna cry. And the Joker's not a crying character.
It still leaves the question, were those flashbacks you saw, were they real, or were they just part of the lies that he was saying?
Sometimes I remember it one way, sometimes another. If I'm going to have a past, I prefer it to be multiple choice.
One of the core tenets in all the Batman stories is that all of us have the light in the dark. A good person can become bad and a bad person can become good, which is why you watch Batman always standing on the edge of the abyss, always struggling. And then you watch the guy who was a very nice guy trying to help his wife, ends up being the greatest sociopath of them all.
There was this grimmer universe being established. The guys who were making Killing Joke and Batman Year One and all of those books at that time, they grew up in the 70s and they did see all the Scorsese movies and they saw the, you know, grim and horrible violence playing out. Jeanette Kahn and Paul Levitz and Dick Giordano at the time, they were the three-headed leaders of DC Comics. They were striving to do important work. They really wanted to show that comics could be something more than just kid stuff.
By the 1980s, those young people who were reading comic books in the 1960s were now adults. And they were starting to demand even more psychological realism from their superhero fiction. They hadn't given up on their comic books because they loved comic books, but they were making more demands. And Alan Moore understood that audience.
I mean, I remember being at Marvel Comics when that Superman annual came out that Alan Moore wrote and Dave Gibbons drew. I was on a plane and I passed it around to all the other Marvel guys I was with saying, this is the most amazing Superman comic I've read in ever. It knocked everybody out. So Alan was clearly a talent.
He's the one who said, oh, superhero fiction as a genre is as expansive as any other fiction. What happens if we start inserting psychological realism into superhero fiction? Instead of a guy dressed up as a bat fighting a guy dressed up as a clown, we have two people who are fighting a philosophical argument, and that might actually say something broader than just the fight on the page. That writing at multiple levels hadn't been seen in comic books before. Well, now there's something to study.
Well, that's what a dose of reality will do to you. It's why I never touch the stuff. I find it waters down the hallucinations.
Most traditional storytelling, you'll be able to follow a very storyboard approach, panel to panel, the progression of the character's actions. What you're getting in an Alan Moore script is the progression of the character's emotions.
Alan was notorious for writing art descriptions that were pages long.
In a normal script, you might get a page of script for a page of art, you know, per book. I think you're almost looking at a page of script per panel for Alan Moore for the level of detail and explanation and setup and layering that goes on an individual panel, because everything is so intricately thought through and thought out so that every panel has a payoff at a later date.
Tell me what I'm doing here. Somebody! Doing? You're doing what any sane man in your appalling circumstances would do. You're going mad.
Visually, this movie was a real challenge. I mean, it's always a challenge when we're adapting something from a comic that's as famous as this one is. People have already kind of got a visual idea in their head about what it's going to look like as a movie.
And Brian Bolland's art is so realistic, and it's so representational of real life. They look like real people in real settings.
Without ever looking like a traced photograph, his stuff is absolutely realistic. It's barely stylized. I mean, his draftsmanship is impeccable.
He doesn't just spoon feed you the imagery, he shows you things, and whether it's gonna impact you psychologically, emotionally, he leaves it up to you.
Brian Bolland is such a great and emotive artist that you see the pain on Jim Gordon's face. The horror on his face is made really clear by Brian Bolland's amazing portraiture. That's not violence that you can dismiss as just a comic book anymore. This is horrible.
And when you have that perfect match, Brian Bolland with Alan Moore, what you get is the subtleties of his storytelling, that when you read, it's this giant epic being told, and you see it in little snapshots, and then when you read the whole piece, it takes on a completely different meaning. And I think it's a testament to the strength of the artist as much as it is to the writer.
Heath Ledger as the Joker, he said, I'm an agent of chaos. But that idea really started here in 1988. It was Alan Moore who really articulated the Joker saying, I'm the Joker because one bad day proves a point, which is that all of the morality and the values that organize our lives have no meaning if life also contains tragedy and horror. So in the story, of course, the Joker tells a version of his history in which he became the Joker because on one day, everything he cared about was broken. What the Joker doesn't know but suspects is that Batman also had one bad day in his famous origin story where he lost his parents to a gunman in an alley. You never know, something's gonna go wrong. Today's the day that it all falls apart. Horror is around the corner if you want to consider it.
You give everybody basically the same scenario, and you watch them all react to it and choices they make afterwards, and that's going to determine the course of their lives. And that's what I think elevates or deepens the psychological weight of the story.
Jim.
It's really a story about Jim Gordon. The Joker is the same at the beginning of the story and at the end. Batman's the same at the beginning of the story and the end. They don't change. They don't really have a choice to make. They fight their battle, and they're going to keep fighting it. Jim Gordon is confronted with the worst day a father could imagine, and he has a choice to make.
I want him brought in, and I want it done by the book.
He didn't break. He doesn't want to kill the Joker. He wants to bring him to justice.
Both of them go through these horrific chain of events, and at the end, the Joker comes transformed and is worse the wear for it. And at the end of Commissioner Gordon's story, he stays true to his being, and he rises above the horrors that he faces to be true to himself.
Batman is a specific hero that threatens the Joker's sense of who he is. Because Batman says, you didn't have to make that choice. You didn't have to reject everything and become a nihilist. Just because there's horror doesn't mean that we have to give up believing in justice. And the Joker says, no, I do think we have to give up believing in justice. And that's what they're fighting about.
I went crazy. And I'm smart enough to admit it. Why can't you?
Same situation for Bruce Wayne or for this character of the comic, and they make different choices and they become very, very different people, which I think is what people can relate to, why it has like a deep psychological bedrock, even though it's a comic book.
First of all, I realize this is probably not how you thought the story would start. Not with a big, shiny moon or a city that could look stunning in spite of itself. Or me.
Obviously, The Killing Joke itself is a shorter story than we usually adapt, so there was a little extra room, movie-wise, that we wanted to show people who Batgirl was and show what is taken away from her. It's one thing to end up hurt, but it's another thing to be such a peak athlete and to have that taken away from you. And I believe it was John Ostrander who came up with the idea of Barbara Gordon becoming Oracle, that I think gave DC one of its greatest characters ever. This now high-tech savvy person, which was a modern concept, but who was also handicapped and at the same time still able to do the heroic work from her chair. I always thought that that was a really great way to follow up on The Killing Joke.
In terms of making a point, the comic book field rallied behind Barbara Gordon after The Killing Joke. And her story continued beyond this one. She becomes a hero just as triumphant as her father Jim Gordon is in this story, except her story extended beyond this graphic novel. But it's the same story, which is, yes, I was confronted by horror, by loss, by disability, and I kept fighting. I kept holding on to the things that give my life meaning.
What you see now is you have a whole generation of writers and artists that have based their interest in comics on the bodies of work of Alan Moore and Frank Miller. You got Watchmen, you got Dark Knight Returns, you got Killing Joke. Those three books basically have transformed the comics industry. And even today, you know, you still have that person or two that still starts their description of comics with the words biff, pow, wham. And those three books are the ones that completely destroyed that myth of what comics are.
You need a different level of psychological depth because you've come to expect it now. It's like once you've had the good stuff, you can't go back to the other stuff. You know, like, oh, like now I know what that is, and you want that all the time. And that influence has just been, you know, pervasive.
20 years from now, people will still be talking about who is the Joker in the same way that people will still be talking about Batman and how much they love him and how he's the quintessential hero. They will then look at the Joker and be like, he is the quintessential villain of our age.
All it takes is one bad day.
Maybe it's just you.
This reminds me of a joke.